6 words, just 6 words, and they have been read at breakfast tables, murmured in hospital chapels, painted on church walls, and quoted in sermons for 2,000 years. I am the bread of life. Most people nod when they hear it, sensing something sacred in the sound. But nodding is not understanding, and what you have been told this phrase means is almost certainly not what it means. The conventional interpretation treats this as a biographical statement, Jesus announcing his unique divine identity to a crowd, a declaration of exclusive spiritual status. That reading has produced centuries of devoted worship, but it has also left something essential locked away, something that was never meant to stay hidden from you. Joel Goldsmith read this passage and saw something entirely different, not a claim of uniqueness, but a revelation of universal law. Not a statement about one man, but a disclosure about the nature of all consciousness. What he discovered in these 6 words has the power to completely transform how you understand yourself, your life, and the source of everything you will ever need. What you are about to learn is not a new theology. It is an older, deeper truth, one that was always present in the text, waiting for the moment you were ready to receive it. To understand what Joel heard in this passage, you first need to understand the context in which Jesus spoke it. The day before, he had multiplied loaves and fishes. The crowd had eaten, been satisfied, and now they were following him, hoping for another meal. They were seeking bread, literal bread, physical sustenance. Jesus looked at that crowd and recognized what was actually happening. These people were not following a teaching, they were following a supply. They had reduced their spiritual pursuit to the level of physical appetite. And so he said to them, with unmistakable directness, "You are seeking me because you ate of the loaves and were filled. Do not labor for the food that perishes." Goldsmith seized on this moment. Here was the entire human condition exposed in a single exchange. Most people approach God, prayer, spiritual practice, even this very video, looking for something they lack. They want the loaves. They want the healing, the money, the relationship, the relief, and that desire, however sincere, places the seeker outside the very source they are trying to reach. The crowd wanted bread. Jesus offered himself as bread. That difference is the entire teaching. Now comes the radical part, the part that Joel returned to throughout his ministry, and that most teachers have quietly stepped around. When Jesus said, "I am the bread of life," the word translated as "I am," in that sentence is the same word the ancient Hebrew scriptures used for God, Ihyeh, I am, the eternal, self-existing presence without beginning or end. This was not a coincidence. It was a precise spiritual statement. Jesus was not saying, "I, this particular man standing before you, am your food." He was invoking the divine name, the name that cannot be owned by any individual, the name that points to the infinite source present in all existence. He was speaking from the I am, as the I am, about what the I am is. Goldsmith understood this distinction with extraordinary clarity. The I am that spoke those words is the same I am that lives at the center of your own consciousness. That is what he spent his entire teaching career demonstrating. Not that Jesus was unreachable, not that divinity was distant, but that the source Jesus spoke from is the same source available to every human being who turns inward and listens. The bread of life is not a person. It is a presence, and that presence is what you are made of. Here is where the teaching stops being philosophy and starts becoming practical. If the I am is the bread of life, meaning the sustaining, nourishing, life-giving presence, then seeking supply outside of that I am is what Goldsmith called the fundamental human error. It is looking in the wrong direction for something that can only be found in one place. Most people live in what Joel called the outer realm of effects. They focus on circumstances, on money, on health, on relationships, treating these as the causes of well-being or suffering. But these are not causes. They are reflections. They mirror the state of consciousness from which they arise. Change the consciousness, and the outer picture begins, gradually, to change. This is not a promise of instant results. Joel was careful about this. He taught that the shift from outer seeking to inner realization takes practice, patience, and often a long period of what he called treatment. Repeated turning toward the inner presence rather than the outer condition. Weeks, sometimes months. But the direction changes immediately. You begin today not by solving problems, but by turning toward the bread, the living presence within, and resting there. That turning is the first step, And it is already a profound shift from how most people have been living their entire lives. Consider someone named Clarence, a man in his late 50s who had spent 30 years building a business, only to watch it dissolve during an economic downturn. By the time he encountered Goldsmith's work, he had tried everything: financial counselors, positive thinking programs, affirmations, prayer, the kind that petitions, that pleads, that bargains. Nothing had shifted the inner heaviness that had settled over him like a fog. What Clarence discovered was not a technique. It was a reorientation. He began reading Goldsmith's commentary on John chapter 6, and something stopped him. The idea that seeking supply was itself the problem. Not laziness, not poor planning, not bad luck, but the posture of seeking from outside what can only be received from within. He sat with that idea for several days before anything changed. The change, when it came, was not dramatic. It was quiet, a sense of something settling, of pressure releasing. Not because his financial situation had resolved. It hadn't. But because he had stopped fighting his circumstances and started resting in a different awareness. Clarence described it as finally eating after being hungry for decades. Not full yet, but fed. Over the following months, practical doors began opening. Not miraculously, but steadily. And he said the most surprising thing was that he had stopped needing them to open in a particular way. Clarence's experience points to something Goldsmith taught with great consistency. The shift in consciousness precedes the shift in condition, but rarely simultaneously. This is where many sincere practitioners grow discouraged. They turn inward. They practice the presence. They rest in the awareness of I am as their sustaining source. And then they look up at their circumstances and find them unchanged. And doubt floods in. Joel addressed this directly. He called it the testing period, the gap between inner realization and outer demonstration. During this period, the temptation is to abandon the practice and return to outer seeking, to conclude that the teaching doesn't work. But he taught that this gap is not evidence of failure. It is evidence that the shift is real and the soil is being prepared. Think of it this way. You plant a seed in the ground and cover it with soil. For weeks, nothing appears on the surface. Nothing visible is happening. But underground, in the dark, something is moving. The seed is breaking open. Roots are reaching. Life is organizing itself in ways you cannot see yet. The outer silence is not absence. It is preparation. Discouragement during this period is natural, expected even, but Goldsmith's counsel was clear. Return to the inner bread. Not once, not twice, but as often as needed. Each return deepens the realization, and the realization is what eventually, gradually, transforms the visible. There is another story worth sitting with. A woman named Sylvia who had been living with chronic anxiety for most of her adult life. She had sought help in many places: medical support, which she continued throughout, therapy, which helped in important ways, and spiritual seeking, which had taken many forms over the years. When she encountered the I Am teaching, she was neither desperate nor dismissive. She was simply open. What struck her most was a single idea from Goldsmith. Anxiety arises from the belief that your life depends on what happens in the outer world. Change that belief, not by arguing against it, but by finding the inner ground that does not depend on outer conditions, and the anxiety loses its foundation. It does not vanish overnight, but it loses its grip, slowly, week by week. Sylvia began a daily practice of sitting quietly and inwardly, returning to the phrase, I am is my bread, not as a mantra, not as a magic formula, but as a point of reorientation, a way of reminding her consciousness where its actual sustenance came from. She kept her medical support throughout. She kept her therapy. She added this practice alongside them, not instead of them. Over about 4 months, something shifted. The anxiety did not disappear, but it changed in character. It went from being the ground she stood on to being weather that passed through. That distinction, she said, made an enormous difference in how she lived each day. Sylvia's story, like Clarence's, demonstrates something essential about how the I Am teaching actually works in human experience. It does not eliminate challenge. It does not remove the outer landscape of life. What it does is change your relationship to that landscape. You stop being at the mercy of what appears and start being rooted in what is. This is what it means for the bread of life to sustain you. Not that problems dissolve instantly upon contact with a prayer formula. but that something in you becomes stable enough to move through problems without being consumed by them. You are nourished at a level that outer circumstances cannot touch. And from that nourishment, clear perception arises. And from clear perception, wise action becomes possible. Joel often said that the greatest gift of spiritual realization is not the healing, not the supply, not the resolved situation. The greatest gift is the consciousness that produces all of those things. Once that consciousness is established, even partially, even incrementally, you carry a resource that cannot be taken from you. That is the bread that does not perish. That is what Jesus pointed toward on that hillside 2,000 years ago. If these stories and teachings are speaking to something real in you, like this video to help others find this wisdom, subscribe for more Joel Goldsmith teachings, and comment below. Which part of this teaching landed most powerfully for you today? Now that you understand the foundation, I am as the sustaining presence, inner recognition as the path, there is a complementary practice that Goldsmith taught alongside this understanding. He called it the practice of the presence, and it works directly with the I am teaching to anchor it in daily life, rather than leaving it as a concept you visit only in moments of crisis. Most people turn to spiritual practice when things go wrong, when the diagnosis arrives, when the relationship fractures, when the account is empty. And while turning inward in crisis is valid, Joel taught that it is far less effective than a consciousness that has been quietly cultivated in ordinary moments. The bread of life is not emergency rations. It is daily sustenance. The practice is simple in description, though it requires genuine commitment in application. Several times throughout your day, not in a formal meditation posture necessarily, but in the middle of ordinary activity, you pause and inwardly acknowledge, I am is present here, not asking for anything, not reporting a problem, simply recognizing that the sustaining presence is the reality underlying this moment, this interaction, this difficulty, this joy. The effect of this practice accumulates over weeks. Consciousness quietly reorganizes itself around the recognition of inner supply rather than outer dependency, and that reorganization changes everything. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the steady reliability of daily bread. There is a second complementary practice that deepens the first, and Joel discussed it extensively throughout his work. He called it impersonalization, and it directly addresses one of the most persistent obstacles to living from I am consciousness. That obstacle is the habit of personalizing both problems and people. When something goes wrong, illness, loss, conflict, the human mind immediately asks, why is this happening to me? What did I do? What does this mean about me? That personalization makes the problem feel like a statement about your identity, your worth, your spiritual standing. It makes the outer condition into an inner verdict, and under that weight, it becomes nearly impossible to find the still place where I am sustains. Impersonalization is the practice of looking at any condition, in yourself or others, and refusing to give it the power of personal identity. The illness is not you. The financial struggle is not you. The difficult person is not their behavior. All of these are temporary conditions appearing in consciousness, not fundamental truths about the individuals involved. You can hold them lightly rather than gripping them tightly. This is not denial. You are not pretending the condition isn't present. You are simply refusing to let it define the territory. I am remains the territory. The condition is whether passing through that territory. Impersonalization keeps you on solid ground while the weather moves. A third tool from the Goldsmith teaching works in powerful concert with everything we have explored, and it addresses the specific way problems appear to grow when you focus on them. He called this practice nothingization. The word itself is unusual and deliberately so. It names something most spiritual teachings leave unnamed. Nothingization is the practice of not giving power to appearances. When a condition arises that looks threatening, when the report comes back with unwelcome numbers, when the relationship reaches a painful impasse, when the body signals something alarming, the natural human response is to intensify focus on it, to analyze, worry, plan, fear. That intensified focus feeds the appearance with mental energy and makes it feel more solid, more real, more permanent than it actually is. Joel taught that everything appearing in the outer world is, in consciousness terms, a shadow, not an illusion in the sense of being unimportant. Real suffering requires real compassionate attention, but a shadow in the sense that it has no independent power source. It draws its apparent solidity from the mental energy you give it. Withdraw that energy, not through denial, but through a conscious redirection toward I am, and the shadow begins to lose its grip. This practice pairs directly with the I am teaching. When the appearance arises, you acknowledge it without amplifying it, then turn toward the inner presence, not fleeing the problem, but returning to the source that dissolves it. These three practices, recognizing I am as sustaining presence, impersonalizing conditions, and nothingizing appearances, form a complete inner system that Goldsmith spent his entire career refining and demonstrating. But there is something he added that ties all three together, and without it, the system remains mechanical. He called this element spiritual listening. Spiritual listening is not passive. It is an active interior orientation, a turning of the inner ear toward the still, small voice that speaks beneath the noise of thought. Most people spend their spiritual practice talking, affirming, petitioning, declaring, confessing. Joel taught that the most transformative moments in spiritual practice are the moments of genuine, open, receptive silence. After you recognize I am, after you impersonalize the condition, after you refuse to give power to the appearance, then you listen. Not for a specific answer to a specific problem, not with an agenda about what you hope to hear, but with the simple, open expectation that the living presence within will speak what is needed for this moment. Sometimes it speaks in words. More often it speaks in a quality of peace, a settling that tells you the bread is here, the supply is present, the presence is sustaining. This listening is the completion of everything else. It turns the I am teaching from a philosophy into a living encounter. Now we need to talk honestly about obstacles. Because while everything we have explored is true and tested, the path from intellectual understanding to lived realization is rarely smooth. And if nobody prepares you for the specific forms resistance takes, you are more likely to interpret normal difficulty as personal failure and abandon the practice before it has had time to do its work. The first obstacle is what Goldsmith called the pull of the senses. Your outer life, the visible, measurable, concrete world of circumstances, is enormously convincing. When bills arrive, when pain persists, when relationships remain troubled, the sensory evidence for those conditions is overwhelming. Everything in your training, everything in your biology, everything in your culture says, deal with this, fix this, fight this, turn your full attention here. The practice of I am consciousness does not ask you to ignore circumstances. It asks you to change where you look for the resources to meet them. That is a subtle distinction that is easy to understand in a moment of calm and extraordinarily difficult to apply in a moment of crisis. This is normal. This is the human condition encountering the spiritual path. Joel knew this. He spoke about it with remarkable compassion. Your work is not to perfectly maintain I am awareness in every difficult moment. Your work is simply to return, again and again, to that inner recognition when you notice you have drifted. The return is the practice. Each return strengthens the capacity for the next one. The second major obstacle is subtler and in some ways more challenging. Goldsmith called it spiritual pride, or the metaphysical trap. It is the point at which a person has learned enough about consciousness teaching to use it as a form of self-congratulation rather than genuine transformation. And it is more common than most practitioners want to admit. It sounds like this. I know that outer conditions are just appearances. I know that I am is my sustaining presence. I am not deceived by the outer world like other people are. That posture, even when unspoken, even when held quietly, is the ego wearing spiritual clothing. It does not reduce attachment. It relocates it. You become attached to being spiritually advanced rather than attached to being financially secure. The attachment simply changes its object. Joel had no patience for this, though he addressed it with characteristic grace. He taught that genuine spiritual realization produces humility, not superiority. When you truly begin to live from I am consciousness, you recognize that the same presence sustaining you sustains every human being, including those who have never heard the name Joel Goldsmith, including those whose lives look nothing like your spiritual ideal. The bread of life nourishes without discrimination. Watch for this obstacle. If your practice is making you feel better than others, gentler adjustments are needed. Real realization makes you more compassionate, not more separate. The third obstacle is perhaps the most universal, and it visits every serious practitioner at some point, usually more than once. Goldsmith named it the period of spiritual dryness. It is the season when the practice feels empty, when you sit to recognize I am and feel nothing, when you turn inward and find only silence, not the rich, nourishing silence of the presence, but a flat, featureless quiet that offers no comfort and no sense of connection. This is not a sign that the teaching has failed you. It is not evidence that you are spiritually inadequate. It is a recognized stage in the deepening of consciousness, described in mystical literature across cultures and centuries. The medieval Christians called it the dark night of the soul. Joel called it the period of the withheld sense of the presence. What happens in this period is important to understand. The particular form of spiritual comfort you had grown accustomed to, the warm feeling, the sense of inner contact, the peace that arrived reliably with practice, is being replaced by something deeper and less emotionally dependent. The training wheels are being removed. You are being asked to rest in I am, not because it feels wonderful, but because it is true. This is a much more stable ground than feeling. The counsel for this period is simply to continue, not to force feeling, not to manufacture experience, but to continue showing up, inwardly, honestly, without demand. The bread will nourish even when the taste is absent for a season. There is a fourth challenge that specifically affects people who come to this teaching from a background of long-term religious practice, and it deserves direct attention because it can create significant inner conflict. It is the challenge of integrating the I Am teaching with sincere traditional faith. Because what Goldsmith teaches does not fit neatly into most conventional Christian frameworks, and that friction can feel threatening rather than liberating. Goldsmith himself was explicit about this. He was not anti-religion. He participated in traditional church settings throughout his ministry. But he was unequivocal that the mystical dimension of the teaching, the direct personal realization of I Am as the living presence within, had been largely absent from institutional Christianity for centuries. Not rejected exactly, more quietly set aside in favor of doctrinal structures that were easier to systematize and transmit. The invitation is not to abandon your tradition, but to go deeper into it. To discover what the mystics within your tradition always knew. That God is not distant, not conditional, not approachable only through authorized intermediaries. That the bread of life is not offered in one location on specific days to approved recipients. That what Jesus said to that crowd on the hillside was a universal disclosure about the nature of the presence available to every human being in every moment. If these teachings on overcoming obstacles are strengthening your practice, like to support this content, subscribe for continued Joel Goldsmith wisdom, and comment. Which obstacle resonated most with you, and what helps you return to the inner presence? Now we move into the advanced dimension of this teaching, the place where understanding becomes so integrated into daily life that it begins to operate even when you are not consciously directing it. Joel described this as the point where the practice becomes the practitioner. The bread of life is no longer something you seek. It is something you have realized yourself to be. This sounds abstract. It becomes concrete in specific daily situations. Consider the experience of receiving unwelcome news, the kind that, before your practice deepened, would have produced immediate anxiety and the frantic search for solutions. In the advanced stage of this realization, something different happens first. Before the reactive mind engages, something in you settles, not because you suppress the reaction, but because the interior ground of I Am recognition is stable enough that the news lands on solid ground rather than quicksand. You still address the situation. You still take practical action where action is called for. You still seek professional guidance when guidance is needed. But you do all of this from a different interior position, from a place that is resourced by something deeper than your own mental or emotional capacity. That deeper resource does not eliminate the difficulty. It transforms how you meet it. Douglas was a practitioner who described reaching this stage after about 2 years of daily practice. He said the most striking thing was not the outer changes, though those were real and measurable. It was the experience of his own mind becoming quieter without effort. Douglas's experience points to something Goldsmith described as the activity of truth in consciousness. At the advanced stage of the I Am practice, something begins to happen that the practitioner does not initiate. The inner recognition of the sustaining presence begins to clarify situations that the human mind alone could not have resolved. Not through mystical intervention in the mechanical sense, but through the natural clarity that arises when consciousness is no longer clouded by fear-based seeking. Here is a concrete illustration. When you are hungry, physically, urgently hungry, your thinking narrows. Your perception becomes focused almost entirely on the absence of food. You cannot think creatively. You cannot perceive beauty. You cannot be genuinely present to another person. All bandwidth is absorbed by the unmet need. The same thing happens in consciousness when the deeper sustenance is absent. When you are running entirely on outer resources, on what you can achieve, acquire, control, and maintain, your inner bandwidth narrows. Creativity contracts. Perception becomes defended rather than open. Relationships become transactional. Life becomes a management problem rather than a lived experience. The bread of life restores that inner bandwidth. As the I am recognition deepens, consciousness opens. You begin to perceive dimensions of situations that were previously invisible. Solutions present themselves, connections form, and none of this is forced or manufactured. It arises naturally from a consciousness that is genuinely, inwardly fed. In advanced practice, the I Am teaching also transforms how you experience other people, and this transformation is one of the most practically significant changes the practice produces. Joel taught a principle he called beholding the Christ in others, and it connects directly to everything the bread of life teaching discloses. When you recognize I Am as the sustaining presence in your own consciousness, you begin to recognize, gradually, imperfectly, but increasingly, the same presence in the consciousness of every person you encounter, not their behavior, which may be confused, harmful, or deeply troubled, not their personality, which carries all the conditioning of human experience, but their essential nature, the I Am that breathes through them as it breathes through you. This recognition does not require you to approve of harmful behavior or dissolve healthy boundaries. It does not ask you to pretend that another person's confusion is not real. It simply asks you to look past the surface presentation to what Goldsmith called the spiritual identity, the unchanging, undefiled truth of every human being. Pauline, a practitioner of many years, described this as the moment the teaching became genuinely joyful rather than merely disciplined. When she stopped seeing her most difficult relationships as problems to solve and started seeing the people in those relationships as fellow expressions of the same presence she was learning to recognize in herself, something softened, not immediately, not completely, but in a direction that kept moving forward. There is a dimension of the bread of life teaching that Joel addressed primarily in his advanced classes, and it concerns the nature of supply itself, not just financial supply, but all the forms of sustenance that human life requires. He taught that the fundamental error around supply is treating it as something that originates in the outer world and must be obtained, earned, competed for, or protected. That framework generates chronic anxiety, regardless of how much is actually present. The teaching of I Am as bread inverts this entirely. Supply, in the mystical understanding, is not something that flows from the outer world toward you. It is something that flows from the inner recognition of the presence outward into visible experience. The direction of flow is reversed. You are not receiving from the world. The world is receiving expression from the living presence within you. This is not a metaphor for positive thinking. Goldsmith was careful to distinguish his teaching from metaphysical approaches that use mental force to attract outer conditions. The I Am recognition is not a visualization technique. It is not a law of attraction practice. It is a direct realization of the nature of consciousness itself, that the sustaining presence is the only source, and that all outer conditions are its expression, not its cause. When this realization becomes real, not as a belief, but as a lived recognition, the chronic anxiety around supply begins, over time, to release its hold, not because the practical dimensions of life stop requiring attention, but because the terror of lacking is replaced by a different relationship to the source of everything. We are approaching the final movement of this teaching, and it is important to step back and see the full arc of what has been explored together. You began this video with 6 words that most people pass over in familiar reverence without ever fully entering. I am the bread of life. And now those 6 words carry a completely different weight. The I Am is not a biographical statement about one historical figure. It is a disclosure about the nature of presence itself, the living, sustaining, nourishing reality that underlies all existence and is available at the center of your own consciousness. Jesus did not speak those words to separate himself from humanity. He spoke them to reveal what humanity is made of. S Goldsmith spent decades making that revelation practical, not as theology, not as doctrine, but as a living practice that ordinary human beings could engage in the middle of their ordinary lives, in the middle of their struggles, their illnesses, their financial anxieties, their relational pain. He demonstrated that the bread of life is not a distant spiritual concept. It is as close as your own inward attention, available in this moment and in the next, and in every moment that follows. What you do with this understanding is yours to discover. The teaching cannot be given to you in its living form. It can only be pointed toward. The pointing is what this video has been. The turning is yours to make. Let's talk about what changes when this understanding genuinely takes root. Not in dramatic, visible ways, but in the quieter, more lasting ways that Goldsmith said were the truest signs of real spiritual growth. Because transformation that is real is rarely loud. It tends to be felt first as a kind of spaciousness, a sense that life has room in it that wasn't there before. One of the first signs is a shift in the quality of your seeking. Before this realization, seeking has an urgency to it, a slight desperation, even in its most disciplined forms. You are looking for something you do not have. After the realization begins to root, seeking transforms into something quieter, more like turning than grasping, more like recognizing than searching. The urgency softens, not because the needs of life have disappeared, but because you have found a relationship with the source, that the needs no longer feel catastrophic. A second sign is a growing capacity to be present to what is actually happening, rather than to what you fear might happen or hope will happen. The mind settles into the present moment more naturally, not because you have mastered some advanced meditation technique, but because the inner ground is more stable, and stability allows presence in a way that anxiety does not. Mildred, who had practiced this teaching for 3 years, said simply, "I still have all the same kinds of days I used to have, but I am different inside them." That is the transformation, not new circumstances, a new relationship to all circumstances. There is something important to say about the relationship between this teaching and the other forms of support you engage in your life. And Joel was explicit about this, so it belongs in any honest presentation of his work. The mystical path is not a replacement for practical wisdom, professional care, medical guidance, or human community. It is an inner ground from which all of those engagements become more fruitful. A person dealing with serious illness does not abandon medical treatment because they are practicing I am consciousness. They bring a different quality of consciousness to that treatment, less driven by fear, more open to what is genuinely needed, more capable of participating wisely in their own care. The spiritual practice and the practical care belong together. Joel never taught otherwise. The same applies to financial difficulty. The I am recognition does not replace sound financial judgment or practical action. It replaces the terror that makes sound judgment difficult. From a consciousness that knows its sustenance is not finally dependent on outer conditions, practical decisions become clearer. You act from clarity rather than from panic. That difference is significant, not magical, but real and measurable in its effects over time. The bread of life is inner nourishment that supports and clarifies all outer engagement. It does not remove you from the world. It sends you more fully and more effectively into it, sustained by a resource that the world cannot provide and cannot take away. You came to this video carrying a phrase you had heard before, and somewhere along the way, perhaps in scene 3, perhaps in scene 9, perhaps in a story that landed unexpectedly, something shifted. A phrase that had lived on the surface of familiar religion moved inward and became something else, something that belongs to you now in a way it did not an hour ago. That shift, quiet, interior, real, is what Goldsmith pointed toward with every book he wrote, every class he taught, every hour of silence he practiced and shared. Not a new belief to carry, but a living recognition to inhabit. I am is the bread of life. The presence sustains. The source is within, and you are not separate from it. The work ahead of you is simply this: return to that recognition. In the morning, before the day rushes in. In the middle of the difficulty, when the sensory evidence for lack is loudest. In the evening, when the day has taken what it has taken, and you are quiet again. Return, and the bread will be there. Not sometimes, not conditionally, but as surely and as consistently as the truth of what you are. This is not the end of a teaching. It is the beginning of a practice that can deepen, quietly and persistently, for the rest of your life. And that practice is available to you right now, not after more preparation, not after reaching some future state of readiness. Right now, in this moment, the I am that is the bread of life is as present as your own breathing. If your understanding of this passage has been transformed today, like this video so others can find these teachings, subscribe for more Joel Goldsmith wisdom that goes beyond the surface of Scripture, and comment, I am the bread, to mark this moment of recognition in your own journey.